Hello, I'm John Harney, the executive editor of the New England Journal of Higher Education. I'm joined by my colleague, NEJHE President and CEO Michael Thomas, for a conversation with Dr. Richard Haass about the state of foreign affairs and foreign affairs education today. Dr. Haass is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations and a veteran diplomat. He served, among other things, as director of policy planning at the State Department, as principal advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell, special assistant to President George H.W. Bush, and a senior director of the staff of the National Security Council. He's the author of several books, most recently, The World, A Brief Introduction. Welcome, Dr. Haass.
Thanks for having me.
Let me ask you first, who is the audience for The World, A Brief Introduction?
It's not a narrow audience. It's not people just like me. In a sense, it's not for people who do this for a living. It's meant for high school students. It's meant for college students. It's meant for people who are students but not classroom bound. I'm an old-fashioned Jeffersonian, and I believe that their democracy requires there being an informed citizenry. And what worries me is we're not informed about the world or about foreign policy. So this is my attempt to reach people both high school, college age, but essentially of any age, because it's written as it's a primer. It's not for specialists. It doesn't assume background or knowledge in the field.
You've mentioned the disconnect in what people know about the world these days, in the United States particularly, or I guess various places. But how do you see the balance shifting between isolation and globalization, especially given the recent US elections?
Well, actually, I don't see, at the risk of being difficult, globalization and isolationism on the same axis. Globalization is simply a fact of life. It's the fact that nothing stays local for long. There's these enormous flows that are fast in speed and vast in quantity that are happening. That's the reality of globalization. And we're living with it or dying from it, if you will, right now because of the pandemic. What began in Wuhan didn't stay in Wuhan. Isolationism is a potential policy response. It's a way of essentially not being involved in the world, not engaging with the world. It's actually been the preponderant policy of American history. If you think about the first nearly, century and a half, plus or minus, of our existence, we tended towards isolationism for the most part. We had one or two short-lived involvements, but we've only been regularly involved with the world beginning with World War II in the aftermath of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But then what was interesting to me was after the war, we decided to stay involved. The question now is we've seen a resurgence of isolationism in both political parties. And ironically, it comes at a time of great globalization where the world, and we may be tired of the world, but the world isn't tired of us. So to me, the question is, the policy question is what's the menu of ways to respond to globalization? What's the menu of ways to respond to other challenges such as China or Russia? Isolationism is one. Multilateralism is one. Working with others. In some cases, and then there's all sorts of other possibilities. Unilateralism. There's uses of this or that tool, military force or sanctions. You then have the entire foreign policy conversation. But I think the most basic choice is how much foreign policy to have. How involved are we in the world?
Richard, I know your book doesn't really, you talk broadly about the notion of global literacy, and you obviously don't specify sort of minimum levels, but how do you think about it in terms of, ideally, what would the levels and the nature of global literacy be, both at the high school and at the college level? Are there models out there that you think are good ones to point to, or how would you sort of specify the overall way people ought to think about this and sort of reaching those levels of competence?
The first thing to say, just to be clear and definitionally, that when you and I, the three of us, use the phrase global literacy, we're not talking about the percentage of people around the world who can read. Turns out it's about 85% of adults, but that's not what we mean. What we really mean are people who are, to some extent, understanding of the world, conversant in what we were just talking about, why it matters, also how it works, some of the basic history, some of the basic understanding of global institutions, of globalization, certain relationships. My view is to be pretty modest in it. I'd say you'd want to know some history, both to learn from it, but also to be able to participate in conversations. Particularly the last 100 years, the world 20th century history, I think is particularly relevant. You would global literacy would require at least again basic knowledge of some of the principal countries and regions of the world. I think you'd want to know about some of these global challenges that partially or largely define this year, like climate change, or terrorism, or proliferation. You might want to know some of the basic concepts in the field, things like balance of power, some of the words we've been kicking around, isolationism, multilateralism. It's the analogy I use, and it's admittedly flawed, is I'm not talking about, if it were language, I wouldn't say fluency. I would say the ability to converse, to get some of the basics, to certainly order off the menu. So it's that I don't think people, we don't need 325 million people in this country who have doctorates in international relations. Indeed. I'm not sure I want to even think about the consequences of that. But we need people to understand some of the basics. But I think that's a good conversation to have. I wrote this book and I said, here's what I think is a foundation. And it's, when you think about what I could have included, it's 300 pages of text. And I said, this is what I think you need to know in terms of history, the regions, how the world operates, the global challenges that are out there. So this was my attempt to answer your question, but there's nothing hard-edged about it. I could very easily imagine and probably agree with someone who would say you don't have enough on this and you have too much on that. And I would say you're probably right, or you may well be right. But let's at least try to get within the same zip code.
Yeah, and you, I think in your preface, you talk about, I sort of think of the three ideas, issues, and institutions, I think is how you phrase it. But it sounds to me like you'd like this to be, if you will, sort of a catalyst for the conversation about what students and people and others ought to know, right? To engage people in
Sure.
thinking about what makes sense in their context and in sort of their realm of influence or educational reach, so to speak.
Absolutely. I don't claim that I've got all the answers. I don't think there is one right answer to it. And at different levels of education, there would be different answers to it, depending upon your circumstances. If you were thinking of working in this area for business, or this area of a career in the military or something, I would say you might want to emphasize some other things. But this was my attempt, again, to begin the conversation, not to end it. And teachers, I would love if teachers were to take it and tailor it for their students and their backgrounds. It's look at the moment, what I would say is we begin from a base that's clearly inadequate. The idea that you can graduate from virtually any school of higher education in this country and not be required to take one of these courses. So your degree, you'd have your degree under your arm, but you wouldn't necessarily know anything about the world. That worries me. Lots of high schools don't even have the option or the resources to offer it. So the conversation of exactly what constitutes literacy, that's a high-class challenge and a high-class question, if you will. And I'd love to have, at the Council on Foreign Relations, we've had many conversations with teachers, people essentially in the classroom, in the high school and the college, particularly at the college level, trying to adapt it for their purposes, and so forth. And in many cases, what I can do is also put forward the questions. We produced a syllabus based around this book, and in part, it's not, at this point, we haven't developed a competency certification. That's something we're thinking about. But for the moment, I really wanted to get students, if they came away with a better knowledge and real interest, that'd be fantastic. Because then it suggests, this may be the first book a lot of students read. I hate for it to be the only book They read in the so there's really, I mean, this has to be lifelong. Think about it. You know, when we all came of age, there was this thing going on called the Cold War. That was the framing. You woke up every day and that was the given. Well, that's gone. There wasn't something called the internet. Well, there is. And so, you know, these things are going to evolve pretty quickly. So I want people to just almost like anting up. I want them to get involved. And then as they go through their lives or their careers, the content will necessarily always have to be added to or subtracted. But a lot of what's in this is probably going to be enduring, only because, again, I wrote this as a kind of evergreen. Some of the basic ideas, some of the basic choices, that while the details will change, the fundamentals will not.
Do you think the market would reward this sort of knowledge if it were certified?
Absolutely. I can imagine that colleges in their admissions would say to high schools, this is something that we would put weight on. I could imagine that employers, I mean, think about for American business, virtually increasingly American business has to think about international markets. Mm-hmm. Increasingly American business has to think about international supply chains of things that reach them. I would think and hope and expect that this would be rewarded, that if I were a recruiter and I had two individuals and one had a basic degree of literacy about the world and one did not, that to me, all things being equal, I would much prefer the person who had a degree of literacy and understanding, because that's the world he or she is going to operate it in. It's going to, in some ways, affect their decision making and their success.
How is that literacy affected by the sort of state of international education right now and study abroad and international enrollment in the U.S.? Is that having an effect, do you think, on?
I hadn't thought about that in terms of, look, Americans going elsewhere. It's clearly been, you know, let's put aside the pandemic, which has obviously put everything on hold for a year or two. American overseas education hasn't been great. It's been way too European focused, often Italy and England. Not that I'm against either. I spent 6 years of my own life in the UK. But most of it has not been all that good. A lot of also special American programs while there. So it seems to me that doesn't necessarily constitute what I would think is an education about international relations, because most students can't avail themselves of it, to be perfectly blunt. Incoming, my experience when I taught at the college and university level, and I did that twice at Hamilton College and at the Kennedy School, I found the international students came with a greater understanding of the world and a greater understanding, for that matter, of the United States than many of their American counterparts. Mm. They were more systematic in their preparation. So I like having them as part of the conversation. I think it's great for students to get global perspectives. I mean, one of the things we do at the Council on Foreign Relations, we produce something called Model Diplomacy, which is a simulation. It could be of the National Security Council, it can be of the United Nations Security Council. I think it would be really rich to have non-American students in that conversation. I also think it would be good for the non-American students to see what the American students are saying. So I think that's all to the good. I love the idea in general of non-American foreign students studying here, and I would hope that a lot of them would stay here. And that gets to a conversation about how welcoming we are in immigration policy. But I think it's been a real source of strength. And even when they go home, I can't tell you how many times I've sat across a negotiating table as a diplomat, and my counterpart had studied in the United States, and almost invariably had really positive memories, and thought. And to me, it was a great investment we made in our relationship with the rest of the world.
Interesting.
Richard, yeah, let me ask, if you were a college and university president, what would you change in terms of learning outcomes or experiences in the undergraduate student realm to ensure that students are better prepared to engage?
Well, I'm going to lose now a significant chunk of those who are watching or listening to this. Let me just warn you. I would reinstitute a core curriculum. And I believe that American schools of higher education, colleges, universities, need to say and define, we can talk about the process that gets you to that point. This is what our graduates are going to, we believe they need to know. It's also fantastic for businesses and other potential people, organizations who would hire them, because you would know that anyone who graduated from XYZ college or ABC university, they would have this under their, you could be confident they would have these competencies and so forth. And it's everything from certain skill-based things about critical thinking and writing, speaking, ability to work in teams, different types of technological fluency and numeracy and all that. But I would want two things. I would want what we've been talking about here for a few minutes, which is a familiarity with the world. I would want everyone to have taken at least a basic course about the world and why it works, why it matters, how it works. And I would want every American student, and wouldn't hurt non-Americans, to have taken a course about on American civics. I think right now we are paying an enormous collective social and political price for the fact that we don't teach our own history, that we somehow assume, I don't know what, by osmosis, that the DNA of what makes a democracy thrive is somehow automatically passed on. Well, guess what? It isn't. So I if I had my magic wand and if I were to accept the job as a college or university president, I would only do so with the understanding that I would make the school a laboratory. And I would say, we are going to develop a core curriculum that we're going to define ourselves. And we'd say, you know what, we're not for everybody. You may say that you don't want to spend your calories or hours or dollars at the college or university level studying these kinds of things, or anything you don't want to study. Fair enough. Then go somewhere else. That's great. And lots of other schools either have no requirements or very generous or loose requirements, and that's fine for them. But I would love to see more schools essentially defining this. I think the process of doing it would be really interesting for the community, for faculty, for students, for alumni and administrators to think through, what do we want to stand for? What do we want this degree to stand for? What do we believe an educated person in the third decade of the 21st century needs to have? What knowledge set, what skill sets? And then we do it. And it could evolve over time, obviously. It's not done in cement. But I would, and then we'd have, I think, greater competition, that this college, you'd know, would do certain things, and this other place would do the other. And I also think there's another benefit. If you have certain types of core courses that everybody has to take, what a fantastic basis for building community. That means everyone will have read some of the same books, will have wrestled with some of the same ideas, will have debated some of the same questions and issues. What better way on a campus to create a sense of community than to have something that's collective? Because right now, way too many campuses, and I know this from my own experience as a student, are increasingly decentralized, where students, study in this area and live in that area. And we think of a campus, or we talk about the college community. Well, guess what? There isn't much of one. And so I like when I hear about freshman experiences at colleges, where everybody reads some of the same books before they come, and they begin with seminars. I love the idea of regular seminars that, again, are based upon common reading. But yeah, I would like a percentage of everyone's 2 or 4 years to be common, and to, again, deal with content sets in the area of civics and global civics or global literacy, and then certain skill sets. I would, that's what I would do. But might explain why I probably will not end up as a college or university president. That might scare off a lot of individuals, but I would love to see it. Brandeis' comment on the court that the states were the laboratories of democracy. I would love to see more and more campuses as the laboratories of education.
John, I'll defer to you. John, you're muted. Apologies.
That's that technology business you were talking about.
We know what your skill set is.
Yeah. I know we've mentioned degrees a few times, and I wonder if with micro-credentials so popular, if there's been any thought to badges or other kinds of programs that could be like a short-term credential that showed world literacy, I guess.
Funny you should mention it. At the Council on Foreign Relations, we've made this a priority, and I already mentioned our simulation model diplomacy. We've also introduced something called World 101, which is a freely available online curriculum that roughly tracks my book, but it's multimedia. It's quite extraordinary, produced by a team of maybe, 20 people, quite extraordinary. And the basic units are all up, and now we're adding a 5th unit on foreign policy, which could be used in conjunction with the others or as a standalone. And we are now also investigating the idea of developing a certification. It wouldn't be one so much that we would administer, but be one that we would develop and could be administered by others, which is what our tentative thinking is. But the answer is yes. A lot of people have raised it. And we're trying to think of how to test for it. Turns out to be a real intellectual challenge. How do you test for, in this case, global literacy? So the answer is we'd love to develop one. We think it would be helpful. We think it might actually encourage more people to get up to speed in these areas. We think it would also help with employers or colleges in terms of accepting people, keep things focused. And we just have to figure out how to, we're looking at other certifications and badges and everything from the technology to how they tackle this question of how do you really structure it and cover it in a representative way. And so if we can do it, we will do it. But that's probably, right now we're focusing on, in addition to everything else we've done, is developing a game for younger people. And then for people at your stage, for the higher education phase, we're looking at certification.
That's helpful. Richard, a recent survey of about 6,000 sort of Gen Z youth, so 14 to 24-year-olds globally, indicated that amongst the sort of preferred traits of an ideal career, this population wanted to interact with people from around the globe and wanted to be involved in solving complex problems. Over half of them feel hopeful about finding meaningful work in addressing global challenges in the near and long term. And they also want to spend more time on subject areas and interdisciplinary issues, including environmental literacy and global awareness. In your view, is there an opportunity? Is there a generational door opening here, generally and specifically as it relates to higher education?
Short answer is yes. If I'm right, and globalization in all of its manifestations, from climate to health, to cyberspace, to proliferation, to trade, to monetary, essentially all these issues, if this is the defining set of issues or challenges of this era, I mean, we'll continue to have great power rivalry. I understand that, but that's not what defines this era. Most of modern history, the last few centuries, great power rivalry was the driving force. I think what distinguishes this era of history is while that will still be present, now we've got this whole overlay of global challenges. So I would think that for students, they would be wise to get up to speed on one or more of them, and not simply because they want to become a diplomat. We're not talking about someone who's going to do this full time or become a professor of foreign policy or international relations. But think about it, journalism, virtually anybody in business now, this is a real advantage, or it's relevant. There's work in thousands of NGOs around the world. There all the other aspects of working in the US government, from the military to intelligence, and so forth. But I would think that increasingly, given technology, and whether it's the technology of communications or the technology of travel, borders will count for less. And so look, think of the United States for what, 4 or 5% of the world's population. We're in the ballpark of plus or minus 20% of the world's GDP. Look, I can do the math then. That means roughly 4/5 of the world's GDP is out there, and 95% of the world's people are out there. So if I were, no matter what I was doing in the United States, that's particularly in business, that's a pretty big market. That means 95% of your potential market ain't homegrown. So the answer is sure. I would think that if I were a young person, I would say for sure, get in, again, doesn't mean you want to make this your career, but I would think that whether it's as a citizen or just as, again, your career might be in some high-tech startup, but you need to know the world. A lot of your employees might be coming from these places. A lot of your markets are out there. Given the nature of supply chains, virtually any supply chain is a walking, talking case of globalization, where all the various components come from different places and can be affected by events and in various. So I would think that schools, universities, would want to think how to best teach this. One of my criticisms of a lot of places of higher education, don't take this the wrong way, is I always say universities have departments, but the world doesn't. Last I checked, there's not this channel or funnel called politics versus economics versus this or that. So more interdisciplinary courses, more programs that are cross-cutting. I mean, if you're going to become an expert on climate, you've got to understand the science. Yeah, I get that, but you've also got to understand the economics. I mean, you need an informed view on carbon taxes, on various other market schemes. You need to understand the politics. You need to understand something about negotiations and international relations. You need to understand something about technology, about carbon capture, and what's the possibility for that, about maybe geoengineering, both the scientific as well as the political dimensions of that. And we could say that about anything else, whether it's preparing for future pandemics or any number of, or cyberspace. And I'm glad you raised it, because let me just tell you one of the problems I find. I am really interested in thinking about, in the field, how do we think creatively about cyberspace? So just recently with the meeting in Geneva between President Biden and Vladimir Putin, the biggest issue of the meeting was not nuclear weapons, was not the Middle East, but was cyberspace. And the fact that it's a largely ungoverned, unregulated space. So the question is, what do we want to see there? What's our definition of success? How might we then get there? Well, one of the problems is there's so few people in this country who have the background to help answer that question. We have some people who really understand the technology, but they don't understand the first thing about diplomacy or negotiations. Or others might understand negotiation theory, but not the technology, or don't understand the economics or the legal issues. And what we need then are some people. I can bring all the separate experts into the room. That's second best. First best would be some individuals who would internalize some of the various considerations and could produce fairly organic, comprehensive analysis, or suggest prescriptions, recommendations that take into account competing considerations. And that is not something that we can, the departments by definition can do. So while I understand, trust me, I understand the importance of getting grounding in a discipline. I'm a great believer in that. I believe there's got to be greater allowance to bring in these cross-cutting considerations, because again, virtually nothing is solved in these kind of stovepipes. It's a beginning and it's a grounding, but it can't be ultimately it can't carry the lion's share of the analytical burden.
Higher education as an industry has been hit hard by policies in the area of immigration and science and technology in recent years. Do you have any thoughts of what the leaders could do together or alone to respond to these challenges?
I do, funnily enough. Look, so much of the immigration debate is negative. You would think that most of immigration is a security concern. And yes, part of the debate is a security concern. And I think there's a legitimate security concern about controlling our borders. But you would hardly know it that immigration has been one of the great boons and one of the great engines of this country's economic success. That we let in over 1 million people a year, legal immigration. And one of the debates ought to be, how do we stack up various criteria there? Should it be family reunification? Should it be education, technology skills, wealth, what have you? And it's almost become a cliche that a lot of people said they believe you should staple to people's engineering and other degrees a green card or something. That we want to attract the best and brightest from around the world, but also encourage them to maybe stay here. And if you look at the Fortune 500, so many of the companies, first or second generation, are involved in immigration. So it's interesting, though, how much of the immigration conversation, though, is not about this. So if I were in higher education, I would be talking a lot more about immigration as a plus, and talking about how it's not taking jobs, but creating jobs. And by the way, in some cases where it might take jobs, that's okay, because we have millions of jobs going empty right now. Just to point it out. But I think it's an unbalanced debate. It's a really incomplete public debate. And I don't think this is the right approach. I'm not suggesting to ignore or minimize the security side of debate. And there's also questions about what we do with the 13 million or so undocumented people here. That's another dimension of the debate. But this question of legal immigration, when I look at the comparative advantages of the United States vis-a-vis China, this is one of them. So right now in Washington, which is one of the rare areas of bipartisanship, is that there's a real change in thinking about China, and much more muscular or competitive approach. Well, I would love to introduce immigration as part of a competitive approach, because then it might get some people who normally wouldn't be thinking creatively, or I think thinking as much as they should be about the upside of immigration, to reconsider their views. So yeah, I think higher education ought to become much more of a voice. And again, I don't understand the intricacies of lobbying and all that, but I would think that higher education has a pretty big collective voice, either at the state level, the regional level, such as yourselves, the national level. And again, I'm just struck by how narrow and incomplete and the immigration conversation is in this country, and we're missing out on one of the things that has really made this country competitive. And I would hate to see us lose that. So higher education might be a pretty good voice to connect some of these dots. I think you'll have real supporters in the business community, obviously the high-tech community. So I'm surprised that the debate's as one-sided as it is, or as incomplete as it is, given what you all have, what's in your collective self-interest, and the natural partners that you would have in the conversation.
And Richard, on a related note, and referencing back to your comment earlier about your work as a diplomat and how you connected with your peers who had been U.S.-based college students at some point, talk about the role of soft power and diplomacy and higher education's role. Do you think it's the same as it has been? Is it changing? What are your views on that?
Look, I think it's still really important when people come here, they create relationships, they learn things. Now, is it anything and everything? No. Xi Jinping spent a year in the United States. It didn't turn him into a liberal. So he is what he is. So I think I'm not going to sit here and make more of a case for soft power than there is. Sometimes hard power counts too. And indeed it counts for a lot, but I see soft power as one dimension of contemporary life, nationally and internationally. I think having people study here is useful, but also there's many other ways to have soft power. I mean, the example we set, quite honestly, we've hurt ourselves badly in the last year or so. I think January 6th was a terrible setback for the United States in soft power competition. Why would anybody want to emulate our democracy when that's the face it shows to the world. At other times, though, we've shown our ability to step up and deal peacefully and successfully with real controversial issues. And the amount of social change we've had in this country has been remarkable. I look at what's happened in my lifetime. I look at the civil rights movement and other changes we've had. So again, without saying we're perfect, without saying we've completed our work, we've come a long way, and other societies don't have this ability. We have the ability to adapt. We have the ability to learn from our mistakes. So I think soft power, the example we set turns out to be important. But sure, I mean, young people around the world are tend to line up outside American consulates. Why? Because they want to go to American higher education. So it's one of our real strengths, and they can get access to a classically liberal education here in ways that they can't often at home. They want to better understand the United States, given our importance in the world. They'll also get a quality education here. So sure, I think it's one of our, when I make a list, I'm constantly involved in debates about, are you positive about the future, negative? How does the United States rank? And inevitably, invariably, when you look at the strengths of the United States, and there's things about capital markets, rule of law, all this kind of stuff. One of the things is the strength of our higher education system, that both for what it does for us directly and also as a magnet for the rest of the world. And even if those people don't stay, that's okay too. I love the fact that hundreds of thousands of people come here, have access to a good education, hopefully leave with a good sense of the United States and American society, and then go home. What better way could there be to both promote respect for the rule of law, equal rights, democracy, and so forth, and second of all, better relations between the United States and other countries. So I think higher education has an important role, has made a real contribution over the years. Yeah, is it everything? No, but is it something? Absolutely.
It's interesting because sometimes we measure the benefit by the international students who stay here, but the ones who go home also do a service for America, I think.
Oh, maybe more so. I mean, they do direct service to us by staying, particularly if they become citizens. I get that. Mm-hmm. But I love the fact that there's people around the world, who have a good education. Then when they're in business or in government, they can really perform. Right. We want these countries to succeed. We have a stake in their success. I mean, think right now in the area of public health. I love the idea that there might have been people who have overseas came here, got up to speed on public health issues, and they go home and they create their own CDC or help their country cope with COVID-19. That to me would be good for them, but also good for us.
What do you think are the career implications for thinking globally on issues like supply chain diversification you mentioned, but also even through the pandemic and climate change seems like the paramount one? Is it going to be important for young talent to be thinking globally about these issues?
Short answer is absolutely. I can't tell you now, every meeting I have with a CEO, these issues comes up. So you can't be in the business world and not think globally. You can't be a consumer and not be aware of the impact globally. Right now, there's a chip shortage, so you can't get the car you want. Or prices go up because of certain shortages, or there's a storm somewhere, or there's a civil war somewhere, and suddenly something becomes scarce or more expensive, or both. So I just don't see how you can live in this kind of a world and succeed, particularly in business, and not be aware of the connections. Now, as a consumer, you can blissfully be unaware so long as you can get what you want. So when you look at your iPhone or something like that, the fact that it may have components from dozens of countries and gone through hundreds of steps and crossed many borders, okay, you're just happy to get your iPhone and you'll shell out what you have to shell out for it. But if you're running a business, and one of the lessons of the pandemic is you can't run a business without either larger inventories or essentially a degree of what do I do ifs. So I have a bit of a hedging strategy. You build what's called more resilient supply chains, or maybe there's questions we ought to expand domestic manufacturing, or maybe we ought to expand stockpiles. But those are the kinds of decisions we're all going to be making. So yeah, my sense is success is going to in part depend upon people who best figure out how to navigate this world where the rest of the world is both important as a market, again, so where 95% of the people are 80% of the wealth, but also for its incoming value. The virtually, a big chunk of what's sold here at some point in its journey has crossed borders. And whether it's just the chips, or which may have originated in Taiwan or some other place, or other components will have come from somewhere. So I just think, particularly if you're in business, I don't see how you can succeed. And what we're seeing also is business leaders are being pressed. I look at, let me just give me 30 seconds. When I taught at the Kennedy School, an institution of higher learning in the New England area, I will add, I remember that the business school kind of looked its nose down at the Kennedy School of Government, because somehow the conceit was that business management was of a higher order than political management. And now when I look at what my CEO friends are doing in the business world, it looks a lot like political management. They've got employees to think about who have political agendas. They've got investors who are demanding this with ESG or this with green, this or that. Diversity issues. They've got supply chain. There's both questions of disruption because of COVID or something else, but also the question of transparency. What about the fact that this product that's central to your supply chain, say to the car you're selling, or this, if you're running a retail clothing store, some of the cloth came out of an area where there might have been forced labor. Human trafficking was involved. So supply chain transparency has become important. So again, it seems to me the idea that business, it's almost like, the old Milton Friedman idea that all businesses need to care about is the return on, to invest in keeping your investors happy. No, it's now become a much more politically complicated and sensitive environment in which businesses operate. And pension funds aren't going to invest in certain businesses, whether it's Goldman Sachs or Blackstone or anybody else, or if certain member companies are involved in practices that don't bear scrutiny. So I actually think politics have intruded on the business world at least as much as vice versa. And that's also to me a real opportunity for higher education, because it means that anybody going through a business curriculum, be it as an undergraduate or as a graduate, they better get a dose of politics, both about the world, what we're talking about here, but also some of these other domestic politics, because the idea that business is about balance sheets, those days are, if they ever existed, is long since over.
Richard, with history as a guide, and certainly the popular commentary these days is that the pandemic changes everything. And, presuming that's either completely or largely true, what opportunities does it create for education and global literacy? Okay,
so I think it's almost completely wrong. I think the pandemic changed almost nothing. And don't get me wrong, it's been a horrific human tragedy. I think the real count is probably 3 or 4x what the formal count is. So rather than 3 or 4 million people who have lost their lives, my guess is it's somewhere between 10 and 15 million people already. But when I say it hasn't changed much of anything, is all the trends that I discerned in place 18 months ago or 2 years ago, I think are still in place. Whether it's we're talking about China or Russia and the kind of stuff, or North Korea or Iran, all those kinds of things, or climate change hasn't, it temporarily slowed because economic output slowed, but climate change hasn't changed its trajectory in any lasting or meaningful way. Economies will recover. So in terms of the world, I think it really hasn't mattered much. I think it's had some impact on certain debates in the United States about the role of government in the economy. That's less because of the pandemic than it is because of China. We're now looking at a degree of industrial planning here. In terms of the social safety net, yes, I think that's gotten expanded in part because of the pandemic. I think there's an interesting question of to what extent does that endure? beyond. And I think we're having a big debate now in the United States, or a growing debate about what's the right size, what's neither too much nor too little a role for government in the economy and in providing a safety net for its people. But essentially the challenges that higher education faced before, I think, are pretty much the same. And again, in the near run, you're gonna have a problem with physical mobility and physical presence. I think the question is, to what extent does virtual life create an opportunity? One thing I've said to my own organization, Council on Foreign Relations, is we should not define success as simply returning to the status quo ante. It would be passing strange if we've been through what we've been through in 18 months, be passing strange given some of the new technologies that have emerged, from Zoom to you name it, and we were not to be changed by them. So just because we could go back to the status quo ante doesn't mean we should. And I think that's part of the conversation for higher ed. I think higher ed was probably ripe for some disruption anyhow. And this is probably, it might be more accelerated because of the pandemic, because it's forced people to think about getting educated without physical presence. So if I were running an institution, I would probably form some kind of a task force now, if I hadn't already, saying, we've done at the council, looking at what do we want to institutionalize in the way of hybrid meetings, non-physical presence for staff, as well as I have 5,000 members. And I would think a university or college would want to do the same thing. What do we want to offer? And puts pressure. I think there's pressure as well as opportunity. How do we make the physical experience different enough and better enough that people want to subject themselves to it and pay for it? Do we offer as part of it or as an alternative to it something of a more virtual? Some of the stuff that places like Arizona State have been, or Georgia Tech have been advancing for years. So if I were in the higher ed business, and particularly given some of the pressures on against immigration, which have hurt some of your foreign presence, which is an important part for many schools of their ability to balance their books, I would basically, either out of necessity or opportunity, rethink a lot of what we were doing and how we were doing it. And I would think this was people with much greater expertise than me on this have said that higher ed was to some extent ripe for disruption. So yeah, they are, despite what I said 5 minutes ago, somewhat cavalierly, but I think, it probably has accelerated the changing environment, and your consumers are probably gonna demand certain things. And so it's probably, I would probably say it's an interesting time to really think hard about what is it you do best in what way? What things really can you make a persuasive case that you need to be there physically? What things can be done hybrid? What things can be done just as well virtually? And maybe it means lots of things get shaken up. I never read in the Old Testament that four-year college had to be a four-year college. Maybe there's different, or that the annual cycle was what it was, or this many courses, or this many classrooms. It just, given the technological revolution, which predated the pandemic and will continue afterwards, it seems odd that there hasn't been more change. And I think what's the relevance of the pandemic may have been an unanticipated, uninvited, but nonetheless real forced experiment. And a lot of your consumers, in the way of actual or would-be students, are thinking things differently. And if I were a university, it's a little bit when you got lemons, make lemonade. I would basically say, okay, what lemonade can we find here? Either out of necessity or, again, opportunity. And I would think, again, coming back to something we were talking about 20 minutes ago, I do think it's a way for different schools, different institutions to differentiate themselves. I think it's very hard just to be another one of these places amongst dozens or hundreds. So I would, if I were running one of these institutions, I would basically say, okay, like it or not, here's the reality. What can we do differently now to basically make the value proposition with actual or would-be students that this is where you want to get your degree from? What do we have to either? I mean, I always write when I talk about my own institution, you've only got two choices as a leader. One is to do different things Second is to do things differently. And if I were the head of a college or university, I would have two columns. What could we do that's different? What different things could we do? And what things that we have been doing could we do differently? And I would think really hard about that. And again, make it something of a community exercise, crowdsourcing, and get them, because people by and large tend to be less resistant to change if they've had a hand in shaping the conversation around it. But I would, in some ways, rather than seeing this as a colossal calamity, there's also something of an opportunity here. So I would probably seize it.
You obviously address, primary and secondary education as well as higher education, as much of our conversation has. I think you appropriately note this notion of topping up and, the reality and the importance of lifelong learning. And I'm curious if you've thought much about that. Certainly you could, I think, make an argument that people ought to be topping up on global literacy in a changing world, and higher education can and does play a role in that. Your thoughts perhaps about how the council may do that, and maybe how higher education could also be involved in that?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Look, just think about it. The average student leaves a college or university in his or her early 20s. Given lifespans and safety nets and the rest, they're probably looking at close to a 50-year run after that. Inconceivable. I don't care how good the education is. Inconceivable that it will be adequate for the next 50 years, given, among other things, new technologies and a zillion other things. Any more than what we received 50 years ago was adequate today. Now, some things have lasting and value, critical thinking, reading, still the ability to read, ability to count, I get it. But much of the content, though, is clearly needs to be supplemented or more. So I would just assume, again, the topping off model, driving down the highway of life. If the average person's going to have, 15, 20, 25 jobs in the course of their careers, well, that's 15 or 20 or 25 educating and training opportunities. And indeed, just to take a step back beyond even higher education, I think mid-career training and education are going to be fundamental. Indeed, given the future of work, the accelerating pace of technological innovation and productivity changes, we're going to need a workforce that can keep up with it. And one of the biggest problems now is the lag between the requirements and the jobs and the skill sets of the workers. So reskilling is going to become I think a permanent feature, and whichever societies are better at reskilling will both have greater social order and harmony, or whatever word you want to use, less inequality, but will also be comparatively better off against other countries. So I just think this is now a permanent part. And if I were in the university business or college business, I'd be thinking harder. I think, again, there's enormous opportunity here. That one thing, so maybe your principal focus is getting people at the start, if you will, the 18 to 22 age, plus or minus. But then how do you structure so over the next 50 years, they are regular, they pull into your intellectual gas station, whether it's physically or remotely, and they top off their tank. Could be working with graduates, could be working with people in every can, could be working with local businesses. Because increasingly businesses have realized they're going to have to do the reskilling rather than wait for the government. Could mean working with states and cities. But I would basically think way more about an education model that wasn't so front-loaded. The 4-year on-campus model, I think that stays a dimension of it. Maybe it's even the lion's share, but it can't be the exclusive role or function of a college or university. I think that can't succeed. It's just major opportunity squandered in if one were to do that. We've increasingly defined ourselves as an educational institution. We weren't when I got there. And for lots of reasons, I'm persuaded that what we've always done, while necessary, is not sufficient. The Council of Foreign Relations has been an important voice in what you might call the inside conversation, the elite conversation. Congress, the executive branch, the New York Times, business leaders, and so forth. But these were people who already voted with their feet opted into the foreign policy international conversation, left a lot of people out. And what I decided and we decided is we're going to try to become a larger force, whether again it's for students and the work we're doing, but also with other what I call force multipliers in the society. So we're trying to reach journalists, trying to reach the people, the religious and congregational leaders who give the sermons every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, people whose jobs you may not associate with international issues, but mayors and governors. They have to worry about climate change. They have to worry about terrorism. They have to worry about trade. Well, guess what? That's kind of what we do. So yeah, I think we've got a large role. So while we continue to do what we've always done, focusing on, if you will, the insiders and our members, what we've essentially done is we're going to set aside a big chunk of our resources and our calories to try to be a resource for a much broader swath of Americans, be they college age, slightly younger, or any age. Since we can't do it physically, we don't have the resources, we're too small. So for us, we're forced to do it virtually, but we can also partner. So we're doing more and more teacher training, professor training for high schools and colleges, and we're trying to get our stuff in the classrooms, and we're going to institutionalize this. People, what's interesting for me, it's been really heartening, is when I talk about it, people shake that, they nod their heads, they go, yeah, you're right. And when I talk about the deficit in this country of either global civics or old-fashioned civics, everybody said, you're right. And so the good news is we've been able, and I think we're going to be able in the future, to raise the necessary resources to institutionalize this, to build a permanent capacity to do this. I want to continue to make all these resources available for free. And so we're going to do it. And for me, I can't say it's the most important thing we do, but just as important is what I would call our trying to shape or influence or be a resource for the insider debate. I want us to be an educational institution, also trying to develop the talent. One of the other things we're doing is, in addition to disseminating product and ideas, I want us to be a developer of talent. So whether it's through hundreds of internships a year, or work we do in high schools and colleges. We have about almost 1,000 of our members are in their 30s, younger staff. But I want us to be to help to develop a foreign policy pipeline, an international pipeline, because right now in this country we don't have it. This field is not in many cases attracting either the quantity of people or the best and brightest, and they're too busy. I understand why people want to go to Goldman Sachs. I get it. I will never speak ill of Goldman Sachs. Some of my best friends work there, but I want people to make other decisions as well, besides financial engineering. And so we are increasingly devoting time and effort to trying to make this to connect young people to this, of diverse backgrounds. And so this is a really interesting future. This is a really viable future. This is a way you can do well by yourself and do well by your community or your country. Has the virtue of being true.
Richard, we'll give you a final opportunity. If you're looking in the eyes of college presidents across New England and nationally, what's the last word you say to them?
Don't be afraid to define yourself. And basically I'd say two things given this conversation. One is start the conversation, if you haven't already, about what you want every graduate to have in the way, not just the skills, but certain contents, certain sensibilities about their country, about the world. And then second of all, think about what you need to do to adapt how you deliver your product and to whom, and to move away from a emphasis on front loading it to on-campus undergraduates, and to think about a business model which is lifelong and reaches a much larger universe of people, either former students at your school or elsewhere, to essentially run with we're living in an era of increasingly distributed technology and capacity. So I would say, don't fight it, embrace it.